Spring of 1976. 13 farmers sat around a table at the Riverside Cafe in McCook County, South Dakota. They met there every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. Had been doing it for years. Coffee, breakfast, conversation about crops and weather and equipment and whatever else farmers talk about when they gather. This particular Thursday, they had a guest. Tom Aldridge, the regional sales manager for Miller's John Deere dealership out of Sioux Falls. He'd asked if he could join them, said he had something important to discuss. The farmers, being neighborly people, said sure. Tom was in his mid-40s, confident, well-dressed, the kind of salesman who could make you feel like you were missing out on something just by the way he smiled. He waited until everyone had their coffee before he started talking. "Gentlemen, I'm not going to waste your time with a hard sell. I'm here because 1976 is going to be the most important year for American agriculture in a generation, and I want to make sure you're positioned to take advantage of it." The farmers listened, some skeptical, some curious. Grain prices are climbing. Export markets are opening up. The government is encouraging production. Everything is pointing toward the biggest agricultural boom this country has ever seen. And the farmers who capitalize on it, the ones who expand now, who upgrade their equipment now, they're going to set themselves up for decades of success. He pulled out a folder, spread brochures across the table. New John Deere tractors, the 4430, the 4630, the 8630. Beautiful machines with turbocharged engines and air-conditioned cabs and power that made the older equipment look like toys. Now, I know what you're thinking. "Tom, those are expensive machines. We can't afford that." Agree, but here's what I want you to understand. You can't afford not to upgrade. The farmers running modern equipment are going to be able to plant faster, harvest faster, cover more ground. They're going to be more productive, more profitable, more competitive. And the farmers still running equipment from the 60s, he shook his head. They're going to fall behind. They're going to miss the boom. And in 10 years, they're going to wonder why they didn't act when they had the chance. One of the farmers, an older man named Warren Peterson, spoke up. "Tom, most of us are running tractors that are paid for. We take on debt for new equipment. We're gambling that prices stay high long enough to pay it off." Tom smiled. "Warren, that's exactly the old thinking that's going to leave farmers behind. This isn't 1950 anymore. Modern farming requires modern equipment, and yes, that means financing. But the return on investment is there. The numbers work." He pulled out a different set of papers, financial projections, charts showing how increased productivity would offset equipment payments. "Look, I'm not asking you to decide today. What I'm asking is that you come down to the dealership this week. Let me show you the equipment. Let me walk you through the financing options. Let me prove to you that this is the smart move." He looked around the table, made eye contact with each man. 12 of you are here this morning. I'm guessing that by this time next year, at least half of you will have upgraded. The question is, do you want to be in that group? Or do you want to be the guy who sat this one out and regretted it? Tom Aldridge stood up, left his business card with each farmer, and walked out. The 13 farmers sat there in silence for a moment. Then they started talking. By the end of breakfast, 8 of them had agreed to visit the dealership that week. 4 more said they'd think about it. One farmer said nothing at all, just drank his coffee and listened. His name was Morrison. He was 51 years old. He farmed 640 acres with a 1962 John Deere 4010 and a 1968 4020. Both tractors bought used, both paid for in cash years ago. After the meeting broke up, one of the other farmers, Dave Hutchins, pulled Carl aside in the parking lot. "You're not even going to look at the new equipment?" Carl shook his head. "Don't need to. I know what it costs. I know what the payments would be, and I know I can't make those payments if anything goes wrong." "But Carl, what if Tom's right? What if this really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity?" Carl looked at his friend. Dave, I've been farming for 28 years. I've seen good times and bad times. And the one thing I've learned is that when someone's trying real hard to sell you something, it's usually because they're making money off the sale, not because you need it. Dave laughed. You're too cautious, Carl. That's your problem. You'll still be running those old tractors when the rest of us are retiring rich. Maybe, Carl said. Or maybe I'll still be farming when the rest of you are working in town because you lost your land. Dave shook his head and walked away. Carl Morrison went home and never called the dealership. And that decision saved his life. Before we go any further, you need to understand what happened to those 13 farmers over the next 10 years. Because this isn't a story about one man's success. It's a story about 12 good farmers who made a decision that seemed smart at the time, and one stubborn farmer who refused to follow them. If you want to know which farmer is still farming today and why the other 12 aren't, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened between 1976 and 1986 changed everything. Let me tell you about those 13 farmers in the spring of 1976. They weren't reckless. They weren't stupid. They were good farmers, hard workers, men who'd been on the land for decades, men who knew dirt and weather and crops. But they all faced the same reality. Farming was changing. Operations were getting bigger. Equipment was getting more sophisticated. And there was a real feeling in the air that if you didn't keep up, you'd be left behind. Within 3 weeks of that Thursday morning meeting, 12 of the 13 farmers visited Miller's John Deere dealership. Dave Hutchins traded his paid-off 1964 4020 for a new 1976 4430, cost $34,000. He financed $30,000 over 7 years at 9%. Monthly payment, $527. Warren Peterson, the older farmer who'd questioned Tom, ended up trading too. Got a 4630, bigger than he needed, but Tom convinced him it was an investment in the future. $42,000, financed $38,000, monthly payment, $666. Mike Sullivan went even bigger. Traded 2 older tractors for a massive 8630. Tom told him that with a tractor that size, he could double his operation in 3 years. Cost $68,000, financed $62,000, monthly payment over $1,000. One by one, the farmers made their trades. By June of 1976, 12 farmers had new equipment and new debt. Total financed by the group, $487,000. Combined monthly payments, over $8,000. That's $8,000, leaving those 12 farms every single month. Every month. For 7 years, whether the crops were good or bad, whether prices were up or down, whether it rained or didn't rain. The only farmer who didn't trade was Carl Morrison. He kept farming with his 1962 4010 and his 1968 4020, kept living in the same modest house, kept driving the same old truck, kept doing what he'd always done. Farm conservatively, spend carefully, and never take on debt he couldn't service in a bad year. The other farmers thought he was making a mistake. Some of them said it to his face. Carl, you're going to regret not upgrading when you had the chance. Carl, you can't compete with old equipment forever. Carl, sometimes you have to spend money to make money. Carl just smiled and kept farming. And then 1977 came. 1977 was a good year. Grain prices stayed high. Yields were decent. The farmers with the new equipment felt vindicated. Look how much ground they could cover. Look how efficient they were. The payments were steep, but they were manageable. Dave Hutchins made his payments with money to spare. So did Warren Peterson. Mike Sullivan's huge 8630 let him farm additional ground he'd rented from a retiring neighbor. His operation was growing. Carl Morrison farmed the same 640 acres he'd always farmed. Made less money than the guys with bigger operations, but his expenses were lower. No payments, no additional land rent. He netted about the same as he always had. At the Thursday morning coffee meetings, the other farmers talked about expansion, about adding more ground, about how the boom was real and they'd been smart to upgrade. Carl listened and said nothing. 1978 was another good year. The equipment payments kept coming, but the income kept coming too. The 12 farmers were holding their own. Then 1979 hit. Diesel fuel prices spiked, OPEC oil embargo. Suddenly the fuel to run those big modern tractors cost twice what it had the year before. Operating costs jumped across the board. Some of the farmers felt the squeeze. The payments were still due, but now their input costs were eating into their margins. Dave Hutchins had to borrow additional money on an operating loan to plant his crop. First time he'd ever done that. Made him nervous. But he got through the season. Carl Morrison, running older tractors that used less fuel to begin with, barely noticed the increase. His operation was small enough and lean enough that the spike in fuel prices didn't hurt him. 1980 brought drought to parts of South Dakota, not everywhere, not catastrophic, but enough to cut yields by 20 to 30% in some areas. 3 of the 12 farmers missed payments that year, had to restructure their loans, had more debt to cover the shortfall. Carl had a down year too, but with no payments to make, he just made less money, tightened his belt, kept farming, and then 1981 came, and everything started to fall apart. Interest rates went through the roof in 1981. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight inflation, pushed rates to record highs. The prime rate hit 20%. Farm loans that had been at 9 or 10% got refinanced at 15, 16, even 18%. Monthly payments that had been barely manageable became impossible. Dave Hutchins saw his $527 payment jump to over $700 when his loan adjusted. Warren Peterson's payment went from $666 to $900, and the farmers who'd taken on additional operating loans to make it through the previous bad years, they were drowning. Worse, grain prices started to fall. The boom that Tom Aldridge had promised would last for decades was over in 5 years. Export markets dried up, the government changed policies, prices crashed. Mike Sullivan, the farmer with the massive 8630 and the $1,000 monthly payment, was the first to go under. His payment had jumped to over $1,400 with the interest rate spike. His grain income had dropped 40%. He couldn't make it work. In the fall of 1982, Mike Sullivan's farm went to auction. Everything. The land, the equipment, the house, 600 acres his father had bought in 1948, gone. The 8630 tractor, purchased for $68,000 6 years earlier, sold at auction for $26,000. Mike still owed $43,000 on it after the sale. He lost everything and still owed money. Dave Hutchins held on through 1982, barely. He stopped taking a salary, lived off savings, made his payments. But in the spring of 1983, he couldn't afford to plant. Took out an operating loan at 18% interest just to buy seed. When the crop came in below break-even that fall, Dave knew it was over. His farm sold in January of 1984. 420 acres, been in his family since 1923. The new buyer paid cash and picked it up for 60 cents on the dollar. Warren Peterson made it to 1985. Then his bank called the loan, said they were tightening credit requirements, wanted full payment or they'd foreclose. Warren didn't have it, couldn't get it, lost the farm that March. One by one, the farmers who'd upgraded in 1976 went under. Not all of them. A few managed to hang on by refinancing, by selling off pieces of land, by taking second jobs in town and farming part-time. But by 1986, of the 12 farmers who'd bought new equipment in 1976, only 3 still owned their land. And all 3 of them had sold off substantial acreage to stay afloat. The other 9? Gone, foreclosed, auctioned off. Families that had farmed for generations, wiped out in less than a decade, all because of a decision made around a table at the Riverside Cafe on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1976. Let me stop here and ask you something. If a salesman showed up tomorrow and told you that you needed to upgrade or you'd be left behind, would you have the courage to say no? Drop a comment because Carl Morrison said no when everyone else said yes. And it made all the difference. Carl Morrison watched it all happen. He went to the auctions, saw his friends lose everything, saw equipment that had cost $60,000 6 years ago sell for $15,000, saw families packing up and moving to town to start over. It was heartbreaking. These weren't bad farmers. They were good men who'd made a decision based on advice from someone they trusted. At the Thursday morning coffee meetings, the ones that still happened, though with far fewer farmers, the survivors didn't talk about expansion anymore. They talked about survival, about making it to next year, about whether they could hang on. Carl still came, still drank his coffee, still listened. One morning in 1987, only 5 farmers showed up to the meeting. Used to be 13, now 5. Dave Hutchins wasn't there. He'd lost his farm and moved to Sioux Falls to work in a grocery store. Mike Sullivan wasn't there. Last Carl heard, he was working construction in Rapid City, still paying off debt from a farm he no longer owned. Warren Peterson was there. He'd lost most of his land but kept 40 acres and a house. He farmed it part-time and worked at the co-op. He looked across the table at Carl. "You were right," Warren said quietly. "That day in the parking lot. You were right." Carl didn't say anything. What was there to say? Tom Aldridge told us we'd regret not upgrading, that we'd fall behind, that we'd miss the opportunity. Warren shook his head. He was wrong. We're the ones who regret it, and you're the ones still farming. Carl took a sip of his coffee. "I'm sorry, Warren. I truly am. You're a good farmer. This shouldn't have happened." But it did happen, because we listened to a salesman instead of trusting our own judgment. We got greedy. We wanted bigger, better, more, and it cost us everything. The other farmers at the table nodded. They all had similar stories. All had barely survived or not survived at all. "What are you farming now, Carl?" one of them asked. "Same 640 acres I've always farmed. Same equipment, more or less. Picked up a newer used tractor a couple years ago to replace the 4010. Paid cash for it." "And you're making it?" "I am. Not getting rich, but I'm making it. Farms paid for. Equipment's paid for. I owe nothing to nobody." Warren stood up to leave, put a hand on Carl's shoulder. "Stay stubborn, Carl. The rest of us should have been more like you." The years after 1987 were quiet. Carl kept farming, kept living modestly, kept refusing to take on debt. The Thursday morning coffee group never recovered. Sometimes 2 or 3 farmers would show up. Sometimes Carl would be the only one there. The landscape had changed. Bigger operations had bought up the foreclosed land. Corporate farms, investment groups, people farming thousands of acres with hired help and modern equipment, financed through structures Carl didn't pretend to understand. The era of the small family farm was ending, and Carl was one of the last ones standing. In 1995, Carl was 70 years old, still farming, still running used equipment, still profitable because his costs were so low. His son, Robert, had come back to the farm after working in town for a decade. He wanted to take over the operation eventually. "Dad," Robert asked one day, "why didn't you ever expand? You could have bought land when it was cheap in the 80s. You had the cash. You could have grown this operation." Carl thought about it. "I could have. But buying more land would have meant taking on debt. And I swore after watching what happened to our neighbors that I'd never owe money on this farm again. Not for land, not for equipment, not for anything." "But you could have made more money." "Maybe. Or maybe I could have lost it all like the others did. Robert, the goal isn't to make the most money. The goal is to still be here when the storms pass. And there's always another storm." Robert nodded. He'd heard his father say it before, but it made more sense now that he was older. "When you take over," Carl continued, "you do it however you want. It'll be your farm. But if you want my advice, I'll tell you what I've learned in 50 years of farming. Own what you have, don't owe what you use, and never take advice from someone who profits when you go into debt. Carl Morrison retired in 2003 at age 78. He signed the farm over to Robert, who still runs it today. The operation is still 640 acres. Robert has modernized some, runs equipment from the 90s and early 2000s now, all bought used, all paid for. But the philosophy remains the same. No debt, conservative growth, survival over expansion. In 2016, someone wrote a book about the 1980s farm crisis in South Dakota. They interviewed Carl for a chapter about the farmers who survived. The interviewer asked him about that Thursday morning in 1976 when Tom Aldridge pitched the trade-up program to 13 farmers. Do you remember what convinced you to say no when everyone else said yes? Carl thought about it for a long time. It wasn't any one thing. It was just a feeling I had that something wasn't right. Tom was awful eager to get us into those tractors. Awful eager. And in my experience, when someone's that eager to sell you something, it's usually because the deal is better for them than it is for you. Did you know at the time that you were making the right decision? No. Honestly, for a couple years there, I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. Everyone else seemed to be doing fine, growing, expanding, looking successful. It wasn't until things started falling apart that I realized I'd been right to stay small and debt-free. How many of those 13 farmers are still farming their original land today? Carl was quiet for a moment. Just me. Of the 12 who upgraded in 1976, 9 lost their farms completely in the 80s. 3 survived, but had to sell off most of their land. None of them are still farming. And the dealer who convinced them to trade up, Tom Aldridge? He retired in 1988, moved to Arizona, heard he did very well for himself with all those commissions from the trade-ups. The interviewer closed his notebook. Carl, what would you say to a young farmer today who's being told he needs to upgrade or expand to survive? Carl smiled. I'd say the same thing I said to Dave Hutchins in the parking lot in 1976. When someone's trying real hard to sell you something, it's usually because they're making money off the sale, not because you need it. Farming is about survival, not about looking successful, and the farmers who survive are the ones who can weather the bad years without losing everything. Those 12 farmers in 1976, they were good men, good farmers, but they made one mistake. They confused growth with success. They thought bigger meant better, and they paid for that mistake with their farms. I stayed small, stayed debt-free, stayed conservative, and I'm still here. That's not because I'm smarter than they were. It's because I was more scared of losing what I had than I was excited about getting something bigger. Today, the Riverside Cafe still exists in McCook County, South Dakota, but there's no Thursday morning farmers meeting anymore. Hasn't been one in 20 years. There aren't enough farmers left to fill a table. Of the 13 farmers who sat around that table in the spring of 1976, only one is still alive. Carl Morrison, now 99 years old, living in a small house on the farm his son still operates. The other 12 are gone. Some died young, the stress of losing their farms taking years off their lives. Some lived longer, but never farmed again. Some rebuilt in other careers, but always carried the weight of what they'd lost. Carl's son Robert still farms the same 640 acres his father bought in 1955. The same land Carl refused to risk by taking on debt for equipment he didn't need. The equipment, modern enough to be efficient, old enough to be affordable, all paid for in cash. And sitting in a shed on the property, preserved and maintained, is the 1968 John Deere 4020 that Carl was farming in 1976 when Tom Aldridge tried to convince him to trade up. That tractor, bought used for $6,800 in 1969, paid off in 1971, outlasted every piece of equipment the other 12 farmers bought in 1976. It's still there, still functional. A reminder of the day 13 farmers made a choice, and only one of them chose survival over growth. So let me leave you with this. Right now, someone's telling you that you need to upgrade, that you need to expand, that you'll be left behind if you don't, that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. But the John Deere dealer convinced 12 farmers to trade up in 1976 with the exact same pitch, told them they'd regret not upgrading, told them they'd fall behind, told them this was their chance to set themselves up for decades of success. 12 farmers believed him. 12 farmers traded up. 12 farmers took on debt for equipment they couldn't afford, and 9 of them lost everything. One farmer said no. One farmer kept his old equipment. One farmer refused to take on debt, no matter how good the opportunity looked, and he's the only one still farming today. The dealer made his commissions and retired to Arizona. The 12 farmers lost their land, their equipment, and their legacy. The one farmer who said no, he saved his farm by refusing to follow the crowd. If this story changed how you think about debt, expansion, and following advice from people who profit when you say yes, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about the farmers who survived by refusing to do what everyone else did. Second, drop a comment. Have you ever said no to something everyone said you needed and been glad you did? Third, share this with someone who's being pressured to upgrade, expand, or take on debt they're not sure they can handle. The dealer convinced 12 farmers to trade up. 11 years later, 9 of them had lost everything. The one who said no still owns his land, and that's the difference between following the crowd and trusting your gut. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.